The first thing to register was not pain, but pressure. A deep, phantom ache seated in the junction of his neck and shoulder. A thrumming echo of a violence he could not recall. It was a resonant frequency, a hum that vibrated through his bones and settled behind his eyes. The second thing was the cold, not the ambient chill of a room left open to the night, but the sterile, manufactured cold of conditioned air licking at his bare skin with an antiseptic tongue. It was a cold that smelled of ozone and recycled oxygen, the signature scent of the authorities' containment facilities. He had not smelled it in 5 years. Elian's eyes opened, but the light was a uniform, pearlescent grey, the kind that offered no shadows, no corners, no sense of time or place. It was the light of a laboratory or a prison. He was lying on a sheet of something that was not fabric, a polymer gel that molded to his form, cool and unnervingly smooth. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting with a leaden slowness, the lingering aftermath of a pharmaceutically induced heat. The room was a perfect cube of white. No windows, no doors he could see, just the seamless glowing walls and the low platform on which he lay. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to needle its way through the fog in his mind, but training smothered it. Panic was a liability. Emotion was a variable to be controlled. He catalogued his state. He was naked. His body felt heavy and used, and the ache in his neck was now blooming into a sharp, insistent sting. He lifted a hand, his fingers tracing the tender, swollen flesh. He didn't need a mirror. He knew the shape of the wound, the precise configuration of the teeth. A claiming bite, permanent, irrevocable. The fog in his mind burned away, replaced by a white-hot, silent scream of disbelief. It was impossible. The arrangement had been explicit, clinical, a registered heat partner assigned by the civic pairing mandate for a single, mutually beneficial cycle. It was a transaction, a biological necessity managed with the detached efficiency of a supply chain. There were contracts. There were suppressants administered post-coitus to prevent bonding. There was protocol. The alpha assigned to him. He remembered the man's scent, a sharp, clean fragrance, like winter air and scorched metal, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of his own heat. He remembered the man's silence, his control. An enforcer, his file had stated. Unit 734. A man conditioned from birth to be a tool of the authority, a being in whom impulse had been systematically cauterized. Such a man did not lose control. Such a man did not bite. A section of the wall shimmered, turning from opaque white to transparent, revealing an observation room beyond. And in that room, standing with the placid stillness of a predator, was him. The alpha. He was dressed in the severe grey uniform of an enforcer, his silver hair cut brutally short, his face a mask of disciplined neutrality. But Elian could feel him, a sudden, intrusive presence in his own mind, a low thrum that matched the ache in his neck. It was the bond, raw and unwelcome, a psychic tether forged in the fire of a fever he barely remembered. The alpha's eyes, the color of storm clouds, met his. There was no apology in them, no triumph. There was nothing but a calm, terrifying watchfulness. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, a former reclaimer who had bought his freedom, who had built a life on the fragile foundation of anonymity. He had rendered services, followed rules, and kept to the shadows, all for the right to be nothing more than a name in a database. Now, he was something else. He was marked. He was bound to a ghost in a uniform, a man who represented the very system he had bled to escape. The wall between them dissolved into nothing, the air shimmering where it had been. The Alpha, Unit 734, stepped into the white cube. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was a statement, a declaration of ownership that vibrated along the new, raw connection between them. The scent of him, winter and metal, filled the sterile air, and Elian felt a wave of something primal and horrifyingly familiar rise in him, the Omega's instinct to submit. He crushed it, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He would not break. He had been broken once before, piece by piece, and had painstakingly reassembled himself. He would not allow this man, this symbol of his past, to shatter him again. He met the enforcer's gaze, his own eyes, dark and wide, holding a universe of cold defiance. The transaction was over. Something far more dangerous had just begun. The silence in the white room was not empty. It was a physical presence, a high-frequency hum that pressed in on Elian, amplifying the sound of his own breathing, the frantic beat of his heart. The Alpha, Unit 734, he reminded himself, refusing to use a name to grant him that humanity, stood 3 meters away, a pillar of grey and silver in the sterile landscape. His posture was perfect, a study in latent power, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. It was the stance of an observer, a guard, a keeper. "This is a violation," Elian said, his voice a low, rough thing, scraped raw by disuse and disbelief. The words felt inadequate, flimsy shields against the enormity of what had been done. A violation. It was a clinical term for a desecration. Kalen, the name surfaced from the datapad file he'd reviewed before the pairing, a name he had deliberately forgotten, inclined his head a fraction of a centimeter. Acknowledgement, not agreement. "The situation has been reclassified," he stated. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of inflection, as smooth and cold as polished stone. It was the voice of automated announcements, of system directives. "My designation is Kalen. You will refer to me as such." "I will refer to you as nothing," Elian countered, the defiance a small, hot coal in the frozen landscape of his shock. "You will release me." The contract stipulated a single 72-hour cycle. No bonding, no claim. It was guaranteed by Mandate 4.7b. Mandate 4.7b has been superseded by Contingency Protocol 9, Kalen replied, his gaze unwavering. He spoke of laws and protocols as if they were immutable forces of nature, as if the flesh he had torn with his teeth was just another clause in a document. "Due to the formation of an unsanctioned bond with a high-value asset, we have been placed in protective sequestration." Elian laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed in the oppressive quiet. "High-value asset. I'm a librarian, cataloging pre-consensus data archives. My value is negligible." He was lying, and the ease with which the lie came was a testament to years of practice. His time as a reclaimer, a psychic operative trained to retrieve data from the minds of dissidents, was a sealed and buried part of his history, a part the authority was not supposed to remember. "Your former designation was Asset 117, Kalen said, and the world tilted on its axis. "Reclaimer, Class Gamma, specialized in deep-level psychic extraction, decommissioned after the Alcyone incident. Your file was flagged for monitoring. My assignment to your heat cycle was not random." The cold dread that had been circling Elian finally sank its teeth into him. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a loss of control. It was a plan, a meticulous, cold-blooded operation where his biology, his most vulnerable state, had been the weapon used against him. The bite on his neck was not a mark of passion. It was the snap of a leash. He was not an Omega who had been claimed. He was an asset who had been reactivated. Why? He whispered, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a terrifying, hollow clarity. Contingency Protocol 9 is enacted when a critical asset is believed to be compromised or at risk of external influence. The bond is a security measure. It creates a closed psychic circuit between us. I can monitor your mental state, your communications, your emotional fluctuations. You are now shielded, and you are contained, shielded, contained. The words were synonymous. The bond wasn't a connection, it was a cage, and this man was his warden. Through the nascent link between them, Elian could feel a flicker of something from Kalen, a ghost of an emotion that didn't fit with his placid exterior. It was a cold, sharp spike of something akin to satisfaction, the calm certainty of a tool performing its function perfectly. It made Elian's skin crawl. He took a step back, his bare feet silent on the polymer floor. His mind raced, sifting through years of training, searching for a weakness, an angle, a way out. But every escape route was blocked by the man in front of him and the invisible chain that now tethered them together. Kalen's head tilted again, a slow, deliberate movement. Your cardiac rhythm is elevated. Your adrenaline levels are spiking. I would advise against any aggressive action. This enclosure is secure, and my directives are clear. You are to be kept stable and cooperative. And if I'm not cooperative? Elian's voice was dangerously quiet. Kalen's expression did not change, but the air between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken threat. Cooperation is not a variable. It is a baseline requirement. The bond allows for adjustments to ensure compliance. The implication hung in the air, colder and sharper than any physical weapon. He could use the bond to hurt him, to control him, not just physically, but mentally, to reach into the core of his being and force him to kneel. Elian looked at the man who wore a face of stone and felt the full, crushing weight of his new reality. He had traded one prison for another, more intimate one. His body was no longer his own. His mind was no longer his own. And his jailer was a man who smelled like winter, a man who had branded him with a quiet, devastating finality, a man whose thoughts were now a faint, chilling whisper at the edge of his own. The days bled into one another, measured not by the sun. There was no sun in this white box, but by the rhythmic slide of a panel in the wall that delivered nutrient paste and water. Time became a texture, a thick, syrupy medium through which Elian moved with deliberate slowness. He spent hours in a meditative state, a technique learned during his reclaimer training to build psychic walls. He was trying to find the edges of the bond, to map its architecture in the hope of finding a seam, a crack he could exploit. But it was not a structure. It was a fluid, a current that flowed between them, and Kalen's consciousness was a vast, placid ocean against which his own felt like a frantic, desperate tributary. Kalen was a constant, unnerving presence. He did not eat when Elian ate. He did not seem to sleep. He would stand for hours in one corner of the room, perfectly still, a living statue in a grey uniform. Other times, he would sit at the small table that emerged from the floor, disassembling and cleaning a pulse pistol that Elian knew he would never need in this sealed environment. The action was a ritual, a reminder of his purpose, his function. It was a message. Their interactions were minimal, stripped to the bare essentials of cohabitation. Your nutrient ration is ready. The atmospheric humidity has been adjusted. Each statement was a drop of ink in a vast expanse of white silence. But the silence was a lie. Underneath it, the bond hummed, a ceaseless conversation neither of them had consented to. Elian felt the ghost of Kaelin's disciplined thoughts, the rigid control he exerted over his own mind. It was like listening to the sound of a perfectly maintained machine. There were no stray emotions, no flickers of doubt. There was only the mission: monitor, contain, ensure compliance. The intrusion was maddening. It was a violation far more profound than the bite itself. He felt Kaelin's awareness brush against his memories, a cold, clinical touch. He would be thinking of the archives, the smell of old paper and decaying data chips, a scent he found comforting, and he would feel a faint, alien curiosity from Kaelin. A query, a flag in a system. Elian would slam his mental walls down, a painful, jarring effort that left him dizzy and nauseated. One cycle, as he was tracing the faint geometric patterns on the floor, a memory surfaced unbidden. It was from his training at the Institute. He was a boy of 16, pale and thin, standing before Director Thorn. Thorn was a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. An Omega's mind is a unique instrument, 117, Thorn had said, his voice smooth as oil, naturally receptive, malleable. In you this receptivity is a gift, a weapon, but it is also a vulnerability. Control is your shield. Emotion is the flaw in the metal. You must learn to be steel, cold, sharp, and unfeeling. Elian had spent the next 10 years forging himself into that steel. The Alcyone incident had shattered it. A retrieval mission gone wrong. He had pushed too deep into a dissident's mind and had been caught in the psychic backlash of the man's suicide. He had felt the man's terror, his despair, his love for his family, all in one searing, explosive instant. The raw, unfiltered humanity of it had nearly destroyed him. The authority had decommissioned him, not out of mercy, but because his instrument was now considered unreliable, tainted by the echo of another's feelings. He had been grateful. He had sought a life of quiet numbness, of ordered solitude. Now, Kaelin was a constant, low-level echo of that trauma, an intrusive presence that threatened to dismantle the fragile peace he had built. That evening, the wall panel opened to reveal 2 meal trays instead of 1. Kaelin took one and sat at the table. He gestured to the other chair, an invitation or a command. Elian remained where he was, sitting on the edge of his platform. "You require sustenance," Kaelin stated, his tone flat. "Your metabolic rate is dropping. Don't pretend you care about my health. Your physical well-being is integral to the stability of the asset. It is a matter of operational readiness." Asset. He was always the asset. Elian stood, his movements stiff, and took the other seat. The silence stretched as they consumed the tasteless grey paste. He watched Kaelin, trying to see past the enforcer, past the warden. Was there a person in there? A man who had made a choice? Or was he just the programming, the uniform, the directive? "Did you know?" Elian asked, his voice low. "Before the pairing? Did you know you were going to do it?" Kaelin paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth. He placed it down with quiet precision. "My briefing was comprehensive. I was aware of the objective." The admission was delivered with the same emotional weight as a weather report. No remorse, no hesitation, just a statement of fact. The confirmation sent a tremor of cold fury through Elian. So you planned it. You went through with that transaction, knowing you would cripple me. The term cripple is an emotional projection, Kalen corrected him calmly. A strategic bond was forged to ensure security. It is a functional, not a punitive, measure. Elian felt a surge of something hot and wild rise in his throat. He wanted to scream, to throw the tray, to launch himself across the table and claw at that placid, unmoving face. But he felt a faint, preemptive pressure from Kalen through the bond, a gentle, insistent push. Calm, compliance. It was a silken leash tightening around his mind. He fought it, focusing on the anger, using it as an anchor. You talk about it like a software update, he hissed. This is my life, my mind. You've trespassed in the one place I had left that was my own. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Kalen's face. It wasn't sympathy. It was analysis. He was studying Elian's reaction, cataloging it, processing the data. The concept of a private, internal space is a luxury the authority no longer deems efficient, Kalen said, his voice dropping slightly, losing some of its automated flatness. Integration is security. Isolation is a threat. He picked up his spoon and resumed eating, as if the conversation was concluded. But Elian had felt it. A hairline fracture in the porcelain of his control. A brief, unguarded thought that had bled through the bond. It wasn't his own thought. It was Kalen's. And it had been a single, cold, echoing word. Isolation. The concept of day and night had dissolved completely. There was only the unwavering, shadowless light and the low hum of the air recyclers. Elian's world had shrunk to the four white walls of the cell and the inescapable landscape of Kalen's mind, a place as sterile and ordered as their physical prison. He learned to navigate the bond, not with acceptance, but with the grim determination of a cartographer mapping enemy territory. He could feel the rigid structures of Kalen's mental discipline, the firewalls he had built around his own core programming. But there were moments, fleeting and rare, when a current of something else would slip through, a deep, resonant melancholy that felt ancient and vast, like the cold between stars. It was a loneliness so profound it had no name. Kalen never showed it. His face remained a mask of neutrality. His movements were economical, precise, but Elian could feel it, an ache that mirrored the thrum of the bond in his own neck. He started to see the enforcer not as a monster, but as a different kind of prisoner, one who had been locked inside himself for so long he no longer knew there was a world outside the walls of his own conditioning. 1. Morning, or what he designated as morning. Elian was meditating when a sharp, stabbing pain lanced through his skull. It wasn't his own. It was a psychic echo, powerful and raw, coming from Kalen. His eyes snapped open. The Alpha was standing in the center of the room, his back to Elian, but his posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The placid ocean of his mind was in turmoil, waves of controlled agony crashing against his internal barriers. Another spike of pain, and Kalen flinched, a small, almost imperceptible tremor. Elian felt an instinct he didn't recognize, an urge to reach out, to soothe. The Omega part of him, the part that was now irrevocably tied to this Alpha, was responding to his mate's distress. He hated it. He hated the weakness, the biological imperative that overrode his conscious will. But the pain he felt through the bond was real, and it was escalating. "What is it?" Elian asked, his voice tight. Kalen didn't turn. A diagnostic feedback loop from my neural implant. It requires recalibration. His voice was strained, the words clipped. It is under control. It doesn't feel under control, Elian said, standing up. He could feel the feedback loop now, a screech of corrupted data inside Kalen's head. It was a weaponized migraine designed to incapacitate. A failsafe, perhaps, or a punishment. A wave of nausea washed over Elian as the echo intensified. He felt a phantom pressure behind his own eyes, a ghost of Kalen's agony. He remembered his training. He remembered how to stabilize a fractured psyche, how to impose order on chaos. It was what he had been trained to do as a reclaimer. He hesitated. Helping Kalen was helping his jailer. It was a betrayal of his own defiance. But the relentless psychic shriek was tearing at his own mind, a side effect of their forced connection. Survival, he told himself. It was a matter of his own survival. He walked slowly towards Kalen, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Don't fight it. You're creating a resonance cascade. You need to interrupt the signal. The protocol is to endure until the cycle completes, Kalen gritted out, his breath hissing between his teeth. Protocol is killing you, Elian shot back. He was 2 feet away now. He could smell the faint scent of ozone coming off Kalen's skin, a sign of extreme biostress. Your implant is broadcasting on a specific frequency. I can feel it. If you can lower your internal shields just a fraction, I might be able to disrupt it. Kalen stood frozen for a long moment. The logical, programmed part of him was at war with the raw, animal instinct to stop the pain. Elian could feel the struggle, the grinding of gears in his disciplined mind. Finally, with a shudder that ran through his entire body, Kalen gave a single, sharp nod. Elian took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and reached out. Not with his hands, but with his mind. He didn't push. He let his consciousness flow along the current of the bond, a river reversing its course. He found the source of the pain, a screaming knot of energy in Kalen's prefrontal cortex. It was the neural implant, malfunctioning, sending a feedback pulse that was frying his synapses. With delicate precision, Elian wrapped his own psychic energy around the signal. He didn't try to crush it. He harmonized with it, matching its frequency, and then, gently, he introduced a counter-frequency, a nullifying wave. It was like tuning a stringed instrument, finding the one note that would cancel the other. For a moment, the psychic noise intensified, and he felt Kalen's body tense, ready to collapse. Then, with a final dissonant clang, the signal fractured, and there was silence, a profound, echoing quiet in the shared space of their minds. Kalen sagged, catching himself on the table. He was breathing heavily, sweat sheening on his temples. He slowly turned to face Elian, and for the first time, the mask was gone. His storm-grey eyes were wide, vulnerable, filled with a dazed confusion. In that moment, he was not Unit 734. He was not an enforcer. He was just a man who had been in excruciating pain. The bond between them felt different. The quiet hum was still there, but it was softer, calmer. A fragile truce had been declared in the war for Elian's mind. Kalen straightened up, the discipline reasserting itself, but the mask didn't fit quite as well as it had before. There were cracks in it now, and through them, Elian could see something he hadn't expected to find: gratitude, and a terrifying, unsettling flicker of awe. "How did you do that?" Kalen's voice was a hoarse whisper. "They decommissioned me," Elian said, a bitter smile touching his lips. "They didn't deprogram me." He turned and walked back to his platform, his own body trembling with the effort. He had just saved his warden. He had just proven how valuable, how dangerous he still was. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just made his own escape infinitely more complicated. The incident with the neural implant shifted the atmospheric pressure in their small world. The rigid formality between them began to erode, replaced by a tense, watchful curiosity. Kalen observed Elian with a new intensity, his grey eyes holding a question he never voiced. The flow of information through the bond was no longer a one-way street. Elian, emboldened by his success, began to carefully probe the connection, testing Kalen's defenses. He found they were formidable, but no longer impenetrable. It was like touching a wall of polished obsidian, only to find a network of microscopic fissures running through it. He began to get flashes, fragments of Kalen's existence. He saw a sterile dormitory filled with identical beds, young boys with shaved heads in grey uniforms. He smelled the astringent scent of a training room, felt the dull ache of bruised ribs. He saw a series of faces, all wearing the same neutral expression, reciting the creed of the authority. Order is purpose, emotion is chaos, the self is secondary to the system. It was a life devoid of colour, of warmth, of choice, a life of pure function. Kalen was not just a product of the system, he was its ultimate creation, a man hollowed out and rebuilt to be the perfect tool. Elian felt a sliver of something that felt dangerously like pity. He crushed it. Pity was a weakness Thorn had trained him to exploit in others, and he would not fall victim to it himself. Their conversations, when they happened, became less about directives and more about data. The frequency you generated to counteract the feedback loop, Kalen said, one cycle, breaking a long silence. It was not in any known reclaimer psychic profile. It was complex, layered. I had a lot of time to practice in the archives, Elian replied, not looking up from the seam he was tracing on the wall. Silence is a good teacher. The Alcyone incident, Kalen stated, not as a question, but as an invitation. The official report is heavily redacted. It states only that you suffered psychic trauma due to subject expiry. Elian's hand stilled. He could feel Kalen's genuine, analytical curiosity through the bond. He wasn't looking for a weakness to exploit. He was trying to understand a variable that didn't compute. Elian, the decommissioned asset, had demonstrated an ability beyond his classification. It was a discrepancy in the data, and Kalen's entire being was programmed to resolve discrepancies. The dissident's name was Anya, Elian said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. She was a historian. She believed the authority was systematically erasing cultural records from the pre-consensus era. She was right. He turned to face Kalen. My orders were to retrieve the location of her hidden archive. I went in too deep. She had built a psychic failsafe. When she felt my presence, she triggered it. It didn't just kill her. It downloaded the entirety of her emotional memory into me. Her fear for her partner, her love for her daughter, 20 years of a life I had never lived, all in a single second. He touched his temple, the memory, a faint scar. The authority calls that trauma. I call it the first time I ever felt anything real. Kalen was silent for a long time, processing. The machine was whirring, trying to fit this new information into its rigid worldview. Emotion is chaos, yet Elian had weaponized it, had used the memory of it to develop a new kind of psychic control. So you hide in the archives, Kalen said, a slow dawning of understanding in his voice, not to be forgotten, but to remember. It was the most perceptive thing anyone had said to him in years. The statement was so unexpected, so close to the truth, that it knocked a brick from Elian's defensive wall. Kalen was not just reading his file, he was reading him. It was that evening that the next phase began. A voice, crisp and familiar, echoed through the room from a hidden speaker. Asset 117, Enforcer 734, report. It was Director Thorn. The blood in Elian's veins turned to ice. Director, Kalen responded, standing and facing the seamless wall as if Thorn were standing right there. The asset is secure. The bond is stable. Excellent. Thorn's voice was slick with satisfaction. Asset 117, your unique abilities have been noted. The Alcyone incident was not a failure, as you believed. It was an unforeseen evolution. You integrated foreign emotional data without psychic collapse. You are the prototype for Project Chimera. Elian felt the floor drop out from under him. Project Chimera. A ghost project whispered about in the deepest, most secure corridors of the Institute. A project to create a new class of reclaimer, one who could not only read minds but absorb them, creating a living library of dissident knowledge, an empathic weapon. Your bond with the Enforcer is the final field test, Thorn continued, his voice dripping with intellectual excitement. We needed to know if you could form a stable, closed psychic loop, one that could be controlled and directed. The Enforcer's neural implant is not just a control mechanism for him, it is a relay. Through him, we can access you. The full, horrifying scope of the plan crashed down on Elian. He was not just a prisoner. He was a tool in a box, waiting to be used. The bond was not a leash, it was a data port, and Kalen was the cable connecting him directly to the man who had first broken him. Kalen, Elian whispered, his eyes wide with horror, looking at the Alpha. Through the bond, for the first time, he felt a powerful, undeniable wave of emotion from Kalen. It was not the cold satisfaction of a completed mission. It was the sickening, disorienting shock of betrayal. Kalen's face was a mask of granite, but his mind was reeling. Relay. Access you. He had been told the mission was about containment, about protection. He had not been told he was a conduit. He had not been told he was the key to another's cage. The bond, the thing he had been ordered to forge, had just made him complicit in a violation he was only now beginning to understand. Thorn's voice cut through the tension. Phase 2 will commence in 48 hours. The Enforcer will receive his new directives. Asset 117. Be cooperative. Your comfort is a low priority, but your utility is immense. The speaker clicked off. The shadowless light seemed to dim. Elian and Kalen stood in the ruins of their preconceived notions, bound together by a lie. They were two parts of a weapon, aimed at a target neither of them could see. And their creator, their master, was about to pull the trigger. The silence that followed Thorn's transmission was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a shared damnation. Elian looked at Kalen, truly looked at him, and saw not an enforcer, but another victim. A man whose very identity was a lie, a carefully constructed piece of machinery who had just discovered he was not the operator, but merely another gear. And through the bond, raw and unfiltered, he felt the tectonic shift in Kalen's psyche. The rigid, ordered world of directives and protocols was fracturing under the weight of Thorn's casual betrayal. The creed, the self is secondary to the system, had a new, bitter meaning when the system itself was deceptive. It was the first time Elian had ever felt true chaos from the Alpha. It was a terrifying, exhilarating thing. Kalen turned from the wall, his movements stiff, unnatural. He looked at Elian, his grey eyes clouded with a storm of emotions he had no names for. Confusion, betrayal, and a flicker of something that looked like rage, an emotion so foreign to his programming it was causing a system-wide error. He lied, Kalen said. The two words were spoken with the flat shock of a child discovering the world is not as it has been described. The mission parameters were false. "Welcome to the real world," Elian said, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "Everything Thorn touches is a lie wrapped in a protocol. He told me my empathy was a flaw, a weakness. He told you your obedience was a strength. He uses the truth as a weapon and lies as a cage." He took a step closer, the space between them crackling with a new, volatile energy. "He thinks he controls us. He thinks this," he gestured to the bite mark on his neck, "makes us a single, compliant unit. His unit." Kalen's gaze dropped to the mark, the symbol of his action, his compliance. Elian felt a wave of self-disgust wash through the bond from the Alpha. It was sharp and painful. "The bond," Kalen said, his voice low. "He can access you through me." "That was the plan," Elian affirmed. "But plans have variables. Thorn's mistake was you. He built you to be the perfect, unthinking tool. But a tool can't feel betrayed. You can." A new thought began to form in Elian's mind, a desperate, audacious gamble. For weeks he had been the prisoner, Kalen, the warden. But the dynamic had just been irrevocably altered. They were no longer warden and prisoner. They were two assets in the same cage with the same master. And they had a weapon Thorn hadn't accounted for: their connection. "He's going to use your implant as a relay," Elian said, thinking aloud, his voice gaining speed and intensity. "But the implant is what I disrupted. I can touch it. I can influence it." Kalen's eyes widened slightly as he followed Elian's logic. "You believe you can block his access?" "Block it?" Elian gave a sharp, mirthless laugh. "I think I can do better than that. I think I can reverse the flow. He wants to use you to get to me. What if we use you to get to him?" The idea was insane. A direct psychic assault on a director of the authority, a man whose own mental defenses were legendary. It was suicide, but the alternative was a fate worse than death. To become Thorn's puppet, his living weapon, his consciousness slowly and systematically overwritten until nothing of Elian was left. Kalen stared at him, the chaos in his mind beginning to coalesce into a single, sharp point of focus. For his entire life, he had followed orders. He had moved from one objective to the next with unquestioning efficiency. Now, for the first time, he was faced with a choice that had no protocol. He could follow his new directives when they arrived, allowing Thorn to use him as a conduit, and in doing so, preserve his own existence within the system. Or he could align himself with his prisoner, with the asset he was meant to control, and defy his creator. It was a choice between the ordered servitude he had always known and a chaotic, uncertain rebellion. "Why should I trust you?" Kalen asked, the question not an accusation, but a genuine request for data. "Because I have never lied to you," Elian answered simply. "And because you can feel that I am telling the truth. Right now. Through this." He didn't shield his intentions. He let them flow through the bond. His fear, his desperation, his defiant, burning will to be free. He showed Kalen the alternative to Thorn's control, a shared autonomy, a partnership forged in mutual betrayal. Kalen closed his eyes for a moment. Elian could feel the internal battle, the lifetime of conditioning warring with the stark, undeniable truth of their situation. He felt Kalen access his own core programming, reviewing the creed, the directives, the thousands of rules that had governed his life. And he felt the moment the Alpha found the flaw in the logic. The system was designed to promote order and security. Thorn's actions, his deception, his project Chimera, they did not create order. They created a master-slave dynamic that was inherently unstable. It was a perversion of the creed. It was chaos disguised as control. Kalen's eyes opened. The storm in them had passed. They were clear, cold, and resolved. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The warden had just handed the keys to the prisoner. The two assets were about to go rogue. The first step was to map the cage. They spent the next cycle in a state of intense, silent collaboration. Elian directed Kalen to run a series of low-level diagnostics on his own neural implant, feeding him the psychic frequencies to use. Under the guise of a recalibration cycle, they were actually creating a detailed schematic of the device, learning its protocols, its backdoors, its vulnerabilities. It was a slow, painstaking process. Elian would project a complex query, a string of psychic code, and Kalen, with his innate understanding of the technology hardwired into his brain, would translate it into a system command. The ARM feedback would flow back through the bond, a stream of pure data that Elian would interpret. They worked without speaking, their communication happening entirely in the silent space between their minds. To an outside observer, it would have looked like they were simply sitting across from each other, deep in meditation. But on a different plane of existence, they were dismantling a bomb while it was still ticking. During this process, their minds intertwined in a way that went beyond the simple monitoring the bond had first allowed. Elian saw more of Kalen's past, not as fragmented flashes, but as coherent memories. He saw a young Kalen, no older than 7, being punished for showing an emotional attachment to another trainee. The punishment was sensory deprivation, locked in a dark, silent room for 3 days until his flaw was corrected. He felt the boy's confusion, his terror, and then the chilling moment of acceptance when he learned to sever the emotion, to lock it away in a place so deep he could forget it existed. Kalen, in turn, experienced the raw, unfiltered echo of Elian's time at the Institute. He felt the crushing pressure of Thorn's expectations, the nausea of diving into the minds of terrified dissidents, the psychic filth that clung to Elian's soul after each extraction. He felt the blinding, searing pain and beauty of Anya's final moments, the memory that had both broken and saved Elian. They saw the paths that had led them to this white room, the different methods of torture and conditioning that had forged them into who they were. Their shared pasts, their shared trauma at the hands of the authority, became the bedrock of a new, fragile trust. There was no room for judgment, only a grim, shared understanding. They were both survivors of the same war, just fighting on different sides. Until now. "The relay protocol is dormant," Elian projected, his mental voice calm and focused. "It's a secondary function of the implant, designed to be activated by an external signal from Thorn's central command. When it activates, it will open a direct channel." "A psychic gateway," Kalen confirmed, his own thoughts precise and clear. He will use my implant's core processor to translate his commands into a frequency you can't block. But the processor has a command queue, Elian countered, a spark of excitement in his thoughts. It can only process one directive at a time. If we can insert our own command into the queue before his arrives, we can hijack the connection. It was a plan born of desperation and a deep technical understanding of their shared prison. The risk was enormous. If their timing was off by a millisecond, Thorn's command would take precedence, and Elian's mind would be laid bare. If their counter-command was flawed, it could short out Kalen's implant, killing him instantly. The activation signal will be preceded by a low-energy primer pulse, Kalen communicated. A handshake protocol. It gives the system a half-second to prepare. That is our window. A half-second. Half a second to rewrite their entire future. I can't do it alone, Elian admitted, the confession a stark moment of vulnerability. My psychic signature is known to the system. It will be flagged as an anomaly. The command has to come from you. I can build the code, the psychic payload, but you have to be the one to deliver it. Kalen didn't hesitate. I understand. I will be the delivery mechanism. The words were simple, but they held the weight of his entire reformed worldview. He was choosing to become a weapon, but this time he was choosing his target. He was choosing to aim himself at the system that had created him. As the 48-hour deadline approached, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with anticipation. They had a plan. They had a weapon. All they could do now was wait for the battle to come to them. Elian found himself watching Kalen, no longer as a captor or a variable, but as a partner. He saw the subtle shift in the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders that was no longer just discipline, but readiness. He saw the focus in his eyes, the look of a soldier who had finally chosen his own flag. The bond between them had transformed. It was no longer a chain. It was a lifeline, a conduit for their shared purpose. The thrumming in Elian's neck was not an ache of possession anymore, but a hum of connection, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone in this fight. Just before the final hour, Elian felt a tremor of something unfamiliar from Kalen. It was a hesitant, nervous energy. If we fail, Kalen projected, the thought quiet and sharp. His control over you will be absolute. He will unmake you. And if we succeed, Elian sent back, his own resolve a warm, steady flame. We will be free. Some things are worth the risk. He felt a wave of something that felt almost like warmth from Kalen, an acknowledgement, an agreement. It was the closest they had ever come to a moment of peace. Then, a new sensation rippled through the bond, a faint, almost imperceptible ping against Kalen's implant. The primer pulse, the handshake, the half-second window had just opened. Now, Elian breathed, the word a whisper in the silent room. Their minds locked together, a perfect fusion of purpose. The final countdown had begun. The half-second was an eternity. In the silent, shared space of their minds, time stretched and warped. Elian became pure thought, a weaver of psychic energy. He took the complex code they had built, a recursive loop, a logic bomb wrapped in a sliver of his own consciousness, and pushed it through the bond to Kalen. It was a payload of pure defiance. Kalen, in turn, became the perfect conduit. His lifetime of mental discipline, once a tool of his own oppression, was now his greatest weapon. He took the psychic code from Elian and, with absolute precision, wrapped it in his own enforcer-level clearance signature. He formatted it, compressed it, and shoved it into the command queue of his neural implant. A single, lightning-fast action. He beat Thorn's signal by a fraction of a nanosecond. The room remained unchanged. The light was still a flat, shadowless grey. The air still hummed with the sound of the recyclers. But on the psychic plane, a war had just been won. Elian felt the moment Thorn's command arrived. It was a brutal, arrogant thing, a psychic spike designed to shatter any mental defenses. But it hit the command queue and stopped. It was second in line, their payload executed first. The logic bomb unwrapped itself inside the implant's processor. Instead of opening a gateway for Thorn to look in, it reversed the polarity. It seized the connection Thorn had just established and turned it into a two-way street. And then, the sliver of Elian's consciousness, the Trojan horse, activated. It wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. Thorn, expecting to find Elian's mind, was suddenly and violently pulled into a memory, not his own. He was plunged into the searing, explosive final moments of Anya, the dissident historian. He felt her terror of being caught, her fierce, protective love for the family he had taken from her, her despair, and her final, defiant act of self-destruction. He was hit with the full, unfiltered emotional backlash that had nearly destroyed Elian years ago. In the White Room, Kalen gasped, his hand flying to his temple. A torrent of psychic feedback was screaming through his implant. But it wasn't pain. It was a symphony of chaos. He was a spectator to the psychic carnage Elian had unleashed. Through his eyes, through the bond, Elian saw it all. He saw Thorn's consciousness reel, trying to make sense of the emotional data bomb that had just detonated in his mind. He saw the director's legendary mental shields, the pride of the authority, crack and shatter under the onslaught of pure, raw humanity. Thorn's mind, so accustomed to cold logic and control, had no defense against the chaotic, overwhelming power of love and grief. A blood-curdling scream, not of pain, but of pure psychic terror, echoed from the hidden speaker in their room. It was Thorn. Then, alarms began to blare, a jarring, cacophonous sound. Red lights flashed, painting their white world in strobes of crimson. System-wide security failure detected, a calm, automated voice announced. Containment breach in Sector Gamma. All units to high alert. They had done it. They had not just blocked Thorn, they had crippled him, sending a shockwave of his psychic collapse through the entire authority network he was connected to. They had turned the system's greatest strength, its interconnectedness, into its greatest vulnerability. Kalen stumbled, his legs giving out. The feedback was intense. Elian rushed to his side, steadying him. Kalen, stay with me. The implant. Kalen gritted out, his face pale. It's burning out. Let it, Elian said, his voice fierce. It's a cage. Let it break. As he spoke, a section of the wall hissed and slid open, revealing a corridor beyond for the first time. The alarms, the system failure. It had triggered an emergency protocol, unlocking the doors. It was their chance, their only chance. We have to go. Now, Elian urged, pulling Kalen to his feet. Kalen nodded, his eyes still dazed, but a new light of determination burning in them. He was free of the implant's control for the first time in his adult life. The ghost in his head was dying. He leaned on Elian for a moment, the physical contact a new and startling anchor in the chaos. The bond between them hummed, no longer a tool of control or a weapon of rebellion, but a simple, profound connection. A confirmation. You are here. I am here. We are together. They moved into the corridor, a blur of motion against the flashing red lights. The facility was in chaos. Doors stood open. Automated systems were failing. They could hear the distant shouts of personnel, the heavy tread of enforcer boots. They were in the heart of the beast, and it was wounded, thrashing in its death throes. Kalen, despite his disorientation, moved with an innate sense of direction. He knew these corridors. He had walked them his entire life. "This way," he said, his voice regaining its strength. Sub-level maintenance tunnels. They lead to the outer perimeter. They ran, their footsteps echoing in the sterile hallways. They were a strange sight. A man in a simple white tunic and another in the grey uniform of the enemy, moving as one. They passed labs filled with containment pods, saw glimpses of other projects, other assets, their faces pale and confused behind reinforced glass. A wave of anger and sorrow washed over Elian. He had been one of them. He was all of them. Their escape was no longer just about their own freedom. It was a strike for every person the authority had ever numbered, categorized, and used. They reached a heavy blast door marked Sector Egress. Kalen slapped his hand on a control panel. A red light flashed. "Access denied. My clearance has been revoked." The system was already adapting, locking them out. "Stand back," Elian said. He closed his eyes, reached out with his mind, and focused on the door's electronic lock. He didn't have the technical knowledge to hack it, but he had something better. He had the memory of a dozen system engineers whose minds he had read over the years. He sifted through the psychic residue, found the override codes, the backdoors, the failsafe commands. He projected a string of pure data at the lock's controller. The red light flickered, turned yellow, and then green. With a heavy groan, the blast door slid open. Kalen stared at him, a look of profound astonishment on his face. "Project Chimera," he murmured. Thorn got what he wanted. A living library. He just never planned on the library checking itself out, Elian said with a grim smile. Beyond the door was freedom, or at least the next stage of the fight. They stepped through, and the door slid shut behind them, sealing off the world that had been their prison. They were out. They were together. And they were hunted. The maintenance tunnels were a labyrinth of cold metal and humming conduits, a stark contrast to the sterile white of their cell. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and machine oil. The only light came from intermittent safety strobes that cast long, dancing shadows, turning the space into a disorienting maze. The alarms from the facility above were a dull, rhythmic throb, a constant reminder of the pursuit that was surely coming. Kalen led the way, his movements now sure and swift despite the lingering effects of the implant burnout. This was his world, the guts of the machine he had served. He moved with a purpose that was both ingrained and newly chosen. Elian followed close behind, his senses on high alert. The bond, which had been a source of torment and then a weapon, had settled into a new function. A silent, efficient communication channel. Left turn ahead. 2 guards patrolling the junction above. Kalen's thoughts were clear, concise. I can hear them. Their minds are scattered. Panic. Elian sent back, his own psychic senses scanning their surroundings, tasting the fear and confusion of the authority personnel. Thorn's collapse had thrown the entire command structure into disarray. They were moving through the chaos, an anomaly the system couldn't yet process. They reached a ladder that ascended into darkness. "This leads to a surface-level ventilation hub," Kalen whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the metal tube. "3 clicks north of the main compound. The terrain is rough. It will be difficult to track us." They climbed, the cold rungs of the ladder biting into Elian's bare feet. He had no shoes, no supplies, only the thin white tunic he'd been given. He was hopelessly ill-equipped for survival, but he felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, he was not reacting. He was acting. He was a participant in his own life. The air grew colder, thinner as they ascended. Finally, Kalen pushed open a heavy grate, and Elian was hit by a sensory wave so powerful it made him stagger. The scent of pine and damp earth, the feel of a cold, wet wind on his face, the sound of rustling leaves, and the sight of the night sky. He had forgotten the stars. In the controlled environments of the Authority, the sky was just a projection, a simulation of weather patterns. But this was real. A vast, dark canvas pricked with 1,000,000 points of cold, distant light. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful. He stood there for a long moment, just breathing, letting the reality of it wash over him. Kalen watched him, his expression unreadable in the faint starlight. Through the bond, Elian felt a flicker of the Alpha's own awe. It was a muted, hesitant emotion, like a man tasting a strange new food for the first time. The world outside the Authority was a variable Kalen had never been programmed to compute. "We need to move," Kalen said, his voice low, pulling Elian back to the present. "They will have drones airborne within the hour." They set off into the dense forest, the grate to the tunnels hidden behind them in a thicket of overgrown brush. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and slick with moss. For Kalen, in his sturdy boots, it was a simple matter. For Elian, it was agony. Every step was a fresh pain, his soft, indoor feet protesting the harshness of the real world. He didn't complain. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward, focusing on the steady, reassuring presence of Kalen in his mind. "Your physical distress is increasing," Kalen projected after an hour of hard trekking. "We need to rest." "We can't stop," Elian sent back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Stopping means they find us." Without a word, Kalen stopped. He turned to face Elian, his form a dark silhouette against the trees. Before Elian could protest, Kalen bent down, sweeping him up into his arms with an ease that was startling. Elian let out a sharp, involuntary cry of surprise. "It is a more efficient distribution of energy," Kalen stated, his tone as flat and factual as if he were discussing a supply manifest. "You are lightweight. I am conditioned for endurance. This will increase our pace." Elian was too shocked, too exhausted to argue. He wrapped his arms around Kalen's neck, his body rigid with tension. Being held like this felt intimate, dangerous. It was a position of utter vulnerability. Yet he also felt the steady, powerful beat of Kalen's heart against his chest, the solid strength in his arms. It was not the cold, clinical touch of a warden, but the protective embrace of a partner. He felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he couldn't name and didn't trust. He buried his face in the crook of Kalen's neck, inhaling the Alpha's scent, winter air and scorched metal, but now mingled with the earthy fragrance of the forest. It was no longer the scent of his captor. It was just Kalen's scent. It was grounding. They moved through the night like a single being, Kalen's strength and Elian's psychic senses working in perfect harmony. Elian acted as their early warning system, scanning the path ahead for patrols, his mind a sensitive radar in the darkness. As dawn approached, they found shelter in a small, shallow cave carved into the side of a rocky hill. Kalen gently set Elian down. His feet were bruised and cut, but the rest of him was just bone-weary. Kalen broke off branches from a pine tree, fashioning a crude screen to hide the cave entrance. Then he sat, his back against the rock wall, his pulse pistol resting on his knee. He was on watch, a sentinel. Elian huddled on the cold stone floor, shivering. The thin tunic provided no protection against the morning chill. He saw Kalen look at him, then at his own uniform jacket. He hesitated for a moment, a flicker of indecision crossing his face. Then, with a decisive movement, he unzipped the thick grey jacket and held it out to Elian. "Your body temperature is dropping," he said. It was another factual statement, but the action behind it was something more. Elian took the jacket. It was heavy, insulated, and still warm from Kalen's body heat. He wrapped it around his shoulders, the scent of the alpha enveloping him. It felt like a shield. "Thank you," he whispered. Kalen gave a slight nod, his gaze already turned back to the forest outside. The first rays of dawn filtered through the trees, painting the world in shades of grey and soft gold. In the quiet of the cave, with the sounds of the forest waking up around them, the reality of their situation settled in. They were free, but they were fugitives. They had no allies, no resources, and the most powerful organization in the world hunting them. All they had was each other, and the bond. It hummed between them, a quiet, constant presence. Elian looked at Kalen, the stoic, silent alpha who had been his jailer and was now his protector, his partner. He realized that somewhere in the chaos, in the shared fight for survival, the lines had blurred. The bite on his neck, the symbol of his captivity, had become something else entirely. It was a brand of defiance, a declaration of an alliance that neither of them had chosen, but both of them were now committed to. He was not an asset. Kalen was not an enforcer. They were just two men, bound by fate and a shared enemy, facing an unknown future, together. The days that followed blurred into a routine of cautious survival. They traveled by night, using the cover of darkness to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the authorities' reach. By day, they would find shelter, rest, and plan. Kalen, with his encyclopedic knowledge of authority protocols, could predict their hunters' movements with chilling accuracy. He knew which sectors would be locked down, where the drone patrols would be densest, how the tracking teams would operate. He was dismantling the system from the outside, using its own logic against it. Elian's role was more subtle. His psychic senses, once a tool for invasive extraction, became their compass and shield. He could feel the presence of other people from miles away, a faint hum of consciousness in the vast silence of the wilderness. He could distinguish the disciplined, anxious minds of authority patrols from the slower, calmer thoughts of civilian settlers in the remote territories they were traversing. They learned to live in a symbiotic rhythm, two halves of a single survival unit. Kalen would hunt, using his skills to trap small game, which he would cook over a smokeless, carefully concealed fire. Elian, in turn, would find clean water, his senses guiding him to hidden springs, and identify edible plants, drawing on the botanical knowledge he had absorbed from the archives. Their conversations remained sparse, but the content had shifted. They no longer spoke of their past imprisonment, but of their future. "There are independent settlements in the Outer Rim," Kalen said one evening, staring into the low flames of their fire. "Places where the authorities' influence is weak. They are chaotic, unregulated, free," Elian supplied, the word feeling strange and hopeful on his tongue. "The freedom to starve," Kalen countered, though there was no malice in his voice. "The freedom to be exploited by local warlords. It is not an efficient model for society." "Perhaps efficiency isn't the most important measure of a life," Elian murmured, looking at Kalen's profile in the firelight. The sharp, disciplined lines of his face were softer now, weathered by the elements. The mask of the enforcer was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was all his own. He was a man deconstructing his own programming, one belief at a time. The bond between them continued to evolve. The constant, low-level flow of information became a source of comfort rather than intrusion. Elian grew accustomed to the steady, calm rhythm of Kalen's mind, a solid anchor in the uncertainty of their existence. He found he could draw on Kalen's strength when his own resolve wavered, a silent, shared resilience. One night, as they rested in the hollow of a great fallen tree, Elian was jolted awake by a nightmare. He was back in the White Room, but this time Thorn was there, his face a horrifying mask of psychic static, his hands reaching for him. He felt the cold, invasive touch in his mind, the feeling of his own thoughts being unwritten, erased. He cried out, a muffled sound of terror. He woke to a firm hand on his shoulder and Kalen's voice, low and urgent, in his ear. "Elian, you are safe." It was a memory. Elian's heart was hammering against his ribs, his body slick with cold sweat. The dream had felt so real. He could still feel the phantom touch of Thorn's consciousness. Through the bond, Kalen was projecting a steady, calming pulse, a wave of pure tranquility that washed over Elian's panicked mind, smoothing the jagged edges of his fear. It was a level of control and gentleness Elian had never imagined the Alpha possessed. "He can't reach you," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. "The connection is broken. I am no longer a relay. I am a shield." The word hung in the air between them. Shield. The term the authority had used for his containment, but coming from Kalen, it meant something entirely different. It was not about imprisonment. It was about protection. Elian's breathing slowly returned to normal. He was still trembling, without thinking, driven by a primal need. For comfort and reassurance, he shifted closer to Kalen, seeking his warmth in the cold darkness of the hollow. He expected Kalen to tense up, to pull away. The enforcer had been conditioned against physical contact that served no functional purpose. But he didn't. Instead, after a moment's hesitation, a strong arm wrapped around his shoulders, pulling him securely against a solid chest. Kalen's uniform jacket was gone, lost somewhere in their journey, and Elian could feel the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. It was the first time they had touched outside of violence or necessity. This was a choice, a silent acknowledgement of the new reality between them. Elian rested his head on Kalen's shoulder, the steady beat of the Alpha's heart a soothing drum against his ear. He felt the tension drain out of him, replaced by a profound sense of safety he hadn't felt since he was a child. The bond between them shifted again, a soft, warm current flowing in the space where fear had just been. It was no longer just a psychic link. It was an emotional one. He could feel Kalen's fierce protectiveness, a clean, unwavering certainty. He could also feel the Alpha's own vulnerability, the quiet confusion of a man navigating a world of emotions he was only just learning to name. He was not just protecting Elian from the outside world, he was protecting him from the echoes of their shared past. "The bite," Elian whispered into the darkness, his voice muffled against Kalen's shirt. Do you regret it?" Kalen was silent for a long time. Elian could feel him searching for the words, for the truth in the unfamiliar landscape of his own heart. "I regret the choice was not yours," Kalen finally said, his voice low and rough with an emotion Elian couldn't quite identify. "I regret that it was an order, a violation." "I do not," he paused, his arm tightening slightly around Elian. "Regret the outcome. I do not regret the bond." The admission was a seismic event. It was a rejection of his entire life's training, an acceptance of the chaotic, emotional, inefficient thing that had grown between them. Elian closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a hot path down his cold cheek. In the heart of the wilderness, two fugitives, two broken pieces of a cruel system, had found something that felt impossibly like home. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he was Kalen's, not by force, not by protocol, but by a choice they were now making together, in the quiet dark.